I never believed in miracles, never saw a reason to. I was a hospice nurse for nearly 15 years, and in that time, I witnessed death more times than I can count. I was the one who stayed when others couldn't, the one who whispered reassurances as hands grew cold, who listened to final words, sometimes clear, sometimes nothing more than a breath fading into silence. I knew the signs, the way the body slows, the pauses between breaths stretching longer and longer until there's nothing left. But in all those years, I never saw anything beyond that. No angels, no bright light, no spirits rising from the bed. Just the slow clinical shutting down of a body. Science had an answer for everything: oxygen deprivation, neural misfires, end-of-life hallucinations. That's what I told myself every time someone slipped away under my care. Faith was for the grieving, a way to make the unbearable just a little easier. I understood why people believed, why they needed to, but I never did. To me, death was just that, the end. Nothing more, nothing less. That night was supposed to be like any other. A long shift, exhaustion settling deep in my bones, my car radio humming low as I drove through the empty streets. The kind of drive where everything blurs together, the streetlights stretching into soft streaks, my hands loose on the wheel, my mind still back in the hospice. Mr. Reynolds had passed away just before my shift ended. A retired piano teacher with fading eyes and fingers that twitched like they were still searching for keys. He always joked that he'd keep playing in heaven. "You'll see, nurse," he'd say with a wink. "One day you'll hear me." I'd smiled at that, indulging him, but I didn't believe it. His words were still circling in my head when I saw the headlights. Too fast, too close. The impact wasn't a moment, it was a violent unfolding. Metal screamed. My body snapped forward, ribs grinding against the seatbelt. The airbag detonated against my face, a blunt explosion that stole my breath. The world spun. Pain flashed through me sharp, burning then. Nothing. Silence. Not the kind that lingers in a quiet room, but something deeper. Like sound itself had been stripped away. I should have been gasping, hurting, feeling. But I wasn't. I was weightless, untethered. And then I saw them. They weren't strangers. That was the first thing that hit me. I knew them. Every single face surrounding me was familiar, though they looked different, healthier, luminous almost. Mrs. Caldwell was the first I recognized. The sweet old lady who used to knit during her chemo sessions, her hands trembling as she worked, determined to finish one last scarf for her granddaughter. In life, her skin had been pale, almost translucent. Now it glowed with warmth, her cheeks flushed with color. Next to her stood Daniel. I had cared for him in his final weeks, a young man who had wasted away a little more than skin and bone, cancer hollowing him out. But here he was whole, strong, standing tall with a smile so bright it was almost unrecognizable. More faces emerged, one after another. People I had only ever seen at their weakest, now vibrant and full of life. Their eyes met mine not as ghosts, not as fading memories, but as something real. They were here, and they were waiting. At first, I didn't move. Not because I couldn't, but because I wasn't sure if I should. The air, if that's what it was, felt thick, dense with something I couldn't name. It wasn't like breathing, but there was a presence to it, something almost tangible pressing against me. Around me, there were no walls, no hospital bed, no rhythmic beeping of machines, just space, not darkness, not light, but something in between, like the color of the sky before dawn, when the world holds its breath between night and morning. It wasn't empty, but it wasn't solid either. It felt like a threshold, like I was standing at the edge of something vast, something just beyond my understanding. And then the realization came not as a thought, but as a certainty that settled deep inside me. I wasn't in my body anymore. I wasn't breathing. I wasn't weighed down by limbs, by hunger, by exhaustion, and yet I'd never been more alive. Every thought, every sensation was sharp, unfiltered. There was no fear, no uncertainty, only a profound, all-encompassing knowing. Like I had stepped into something I had always been a part of, but I'd only just remembered. Then they started moving toward me. Not hurried, not overwhelming, just a slow, steady closing of space, as if this moment had already been set in motion long before I arrived. There was no hesitation in them, no uncertainty. Just quiet certainty, like the tide returning to shore. I should have been afraid. Rationally, none of this made sense. But fear was an idea so distant, it barely existed. Instead, there was a warmth growing inside me, something deep and steady, like embers catching fire. And then I saw it in their eyes. It wasn't just recognition, it was love, but not the kind I had known in life left tangled in expectations and conditions and the quiet ache of wanting to be understood. No, this was something whole, absolute. A love that saw everything, every exhausted sigh at a patient's bedside, every moment of doubt, every unspoken thought I had carried alone and accepted it without question. I didn't deserve that. I wasn't religious. Hadn't lived a life of unwavering faith, hadn't prayed, hadn't even believed in anything beyond what I could touch and measure. I had spent years watching people die, and I had convinced myself there was nothing beyond that final breath. And yet, here they were, standing before me, waiting, welcoming me as if I had always been meant to be here. Then one of them stepped forward, Mr. Reynolds, the last patient I had seen before leaving work that night. For a second, my mind couldn't reconcile it. I had watched him take his last breath. I had felt the stillness settle over him, had seen the life slip away from his body. And yet, here he was, standing before me, whole, vibrant, alive in a way I had never seen before. His eyes still had that twinkle, the same playful glint he wore when he teased me about heaven. He tilted his head, gave me that familiar, knowing smile, told you. 2 simple words, no angelic chorus, no grand revelations. Just that same quiet amusement, as if we were back in his room, as if none of this should surprise me. Something caught in my chest, a pressure, an ache I couldn't define. It wasn't sadness, wasn't regret. It was the weight of understanding, the weight of knowing everything I had dismissed, every explanation I had clung to, every time I had convinced myself that death was the end. I had been wrong. There was something after this life, something beautiful, something undeniable. I wanted to speak, to ask, to demand answers, but the words never came. Not because I couldn't form them, but because they weren't needed. Somehow, I already knew. The questions that had haunted me for years, did they know? Were they afraid? Was it really just nothing? Had been answered without a single word. They weren't lost. They weren't gone. They had simply moved, and now, impossibly, they were here, waiting for me. Mr. Reynolds reached out, his hand hovering just in front of me. Not demanding, not pleading, just waiting. An invitation, a choice. For the first time in my life, I hesitated. Not because I doubted what was happening, but because I felt at that moment of standing on the edge of something vast, something unknowable. The kind of step that once taken could never be undone. Behind him, the others stood in quiet patience. No urgency, no pressure, just unwavering presence, as if they had all been here before, standing at this same threshold. And then I felt it, a pull, faint but insistent, something at the edge of my awareness, like a thread unraveling, tugging me backward. It wasn't a voice, it wasn't a force, but it was there, a tether to something unfinished. I wasn't fully here, not yet. The realization settled in my chest like a weight. As much as I wanted to step forward, as much as I longed to accept whatever lay beyond this moment, something in me resisted. I stood there, caught between 2 realities, feeling the gentle pull of something I couldn't see but knew was calling me back. The others didn't move. They didn't try to sway me or urge me forward. They just waited. And in their stillness, I understood they knew this moment better than I did, because maybe they had all stood where I was standing now. Maybe they had all faced this same impossible decision. I turned my eyes back to Mr. Reynolds. His hand remained extended, his expression kind, patient, expectant. And for a moment, I wasn't looking at the man standing before me. I was remembering him as he had been, fragile, frail, his hands trembling as he played invisible piano keys on his hospital blanket, too weak to lift his arms, but unwilling to let go of the music in his mind. But now he was whole. They all were. A thought rose, unbidden, in my mind. Is this where I'm supposed to be? The answer came not as a voice, not as a command, but as something deeper. A knowing, not yet. It wasn't forced upon me, it simply was, as clear as my own heartbeat had once been. I didn't belong here, not yet. The realization settled over me not as relief, not as fear, but as something else entirely. Sadness. Because for the first time in my life, I wanted to believe. I wanted to stay. To step fully into the peace that radiated from them, to let go of everything I carried for so long. But the pull at my back grew stronger, not abrupt, not violent, just steady, like an unseen hand, firm yet gentle, guiding me away. Mr. Reynolds nodded, as if he had known this all along, and slowly lowered his hand. The others watched, not with disappointment, not with sorrow, but with something even more profound. Understanding. They weren't losing me. Not really. They were just letting me go. And the moment I accepted that I wasn't staying, the world around me began to shift. The space, the warmth, the light all started to fade. Not like something being taken away, but like the last notes of a song dissolving into silence. A natural ending, a gentle return. Then I felt it. Motion. A force tugging at me, steady and unstoppable. Pulling me backward, away from them. Away from there. It wasn't painful, but it was all-consuming. Like being caught in a current too strong to fight. I wanted to hold on. To grasp onto the moment. To take some part of it with me. But I knew deeply, instinctively, that I wouldn't remember all of it. That was just the way it worked. The understanding I had here, the clarity, the knowing it would slip through my fingers the moment I returned. And yet, even as everything blurred and faded, one truth remained. I had been there. And it had been real. And then I was back. Pain came first. A crushing weight on my chest, like a boulder pressing me down. The sharp sting of air tearing into my lungs. The metallic tang of blood pooling in my mouth. My body screamed with sensations, overwhelming, unbearable. Then came the noise. A rush of sound flooding into me, all at once shouting, sirens wailing in the distance, the frantic urgency of voices I didn't recognize, someone calling my name, hands on me, pressing, pushing, pulling me back. But I didn't want to be back. My body felt wrong, too heavy, too tight, like I had been stuffed inside it too fast, like I wasn't meant to fit anymore. My limbs were sluggish, foreign, as if they no longer belonged to me. But worse than the pain, worse than the disorientation, was the loss. The aching, hollow emptiness where that place had been. It felt like waking from the most vivid dream of your life, only to have it slip through your fingers the moment your eyes open. Except this wasn't a dream. It had been real. More real than anything I had ever known. And now I was here again, gasping for breath, blinded by harsh fluorescent lights, while strangers in uniforms fought to keep me tethered to a body that no longer felt like home. I drifted in and out after that, my mind lagging behind, caught somewhere between where I'd been and where I was now. I remember the paramedics, 2 men, one with a shaved head, the other with thick glasses speaking in clipped, urgent tones. Stay with us, BP's stabilizing. I could feel the stiff collar digging into my neck, the tight straps pinning me to the stretcher, but none of it felt real. Not the ambulance, not the movement, not even the pain. It was like watching from a distance, detached, as if some part of me still hadn't fully returned. Every time I closed my eyes, I half expected to see them again, to step back into that in-between space where time didn't exist, where the ones I had lost had been waiting for me. But they were gone. And I was here, trapped, bound to the crushing weight of flesh and bone. The hospital stay was a blur of bright lights, beeping machines, and voices that never quite felt real. Doctors came and went, speaking in clipped, practiced tones. A concussion, broken ribs, internal bruising, nothing they hadn't seen before. They called me lucky. A miracle, one of the nurses whispered when she thought I wasn't listening. That word used to make me roll my eyes. Miracles were just coincidences dressed up in wishful thinking, a way to make sense of the senseless. But now I wasn't so sure. I couldn't dismiss what I had seen. I couldn't shake a knowing that still lingered in my bones, deeper than thought, deeper than memory. For days I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying it over and over in my mind. The faces, the warmth, the peace that had wrapped around me like something I had always belonged to. I wanted to tell someone, needed to ask if anyone else had been there, if anyone else had seen what I saw. But what would I even say? I barely believed it myself. So I stayed quiet. When the doctors asked how I was feeling, I stuck to the physical, the aches, the fatigue, the dizziness that lingered like a shadow. I didn't mention the faces waiting for me in that space beyond time. I didn't talk about the feeling of belonging, the weightlessness, the way I had known without a doubt that death wasn't the end. What was I supposed to say? That I, the nurse who never believed in miracles, had been welcomed by the very souls I had watched slip away. That I had felt something beyond this life, something I couldn't measure or diagnose. I could already picture their faces polite, concerned, the subtle shift in their expressions, the careful, gentle suggestions that maybe it was just my brain playing tricks on me. A lack of oxygen, a stress response. A dream. Maybe that explanation would have satisfied me before. But not now. Now I knew better. I knew what I had experienced. I just wasn't sure the world would ever make room for it the way I needed it to. So I went back to work, slowly, carefully, easing myself into the routine I had known for years, trying to find my footing in a world that no longer felt the same. But nothing was the same. The first time I sat at a dying patient's bedside again, I felt that shift in perspective, the awareness I couldn't unsee. I no longer saw death as an end, no longer as a shutting down of systems, an irreversible stillness. I saw it as a door, a passage, and I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I still did my job, checked vitals, administered meds, held hands, comforted grieving families. But something had changed. When a patient asked me if I thought there was something beyond this life, I no longer dodged the question, no longer gave them a vague, neutral response. I looked them in the eye, and I said, yes, not because I believed it, but because I knew it. And that changed everything. For a long time, I wondered, why me? Why had I been given that glimpse beyond the veil, when so many others brushed against death and saw nothing? I wasn't special. I wasn't religious. I had spent years dismissing stories like the one I was now too afraid to tell. Maybe it was because I had spent my life standing at the edge of death, holding the hands of those who crossed over. Maybe it was because I needed to see it for myself, because no amount of stories, no amount of faith could have convinced me otherwise. Or maybe it was never about me at all. Maybe it was about them. The patients who had whispered their last words into the quiet of a hospital room, trusting that I would be there to witness them. The ones who had left behind unanswered questions, lingering in the space between here and whatever comes next. Maybe they had been waiting for me. Maybe they knew I needed proof in a way others didn't. I still don't have all the answers. I don't think I ever will, but I know this much: death isn't the end. Not in the way I once believed. I don't know what lies beyond that waiting space, beyond the faces that greeted me with knowing smiles. I don't know what comes after, but I know something does. And that knowledge has changed me in ways I can't fully explain. I still have bad days. I still lose patience. I still feel the weight of grief pressing heavy in the quiet hours of the night. But now, when I sit with someone in their final moments, I'm not just offering them comfort. I'm offering them certainty. I hold their hand a little tighter. I tell them it's okay to let go. And sometimes, just before the end, they look past me, their eyes lighting up with recognition at something I can't see. And in that moment, I know they are not alone. They never were. And neither are we.